Social Security about to have its largest increase in over 40 years. Increases that are projected to be even larger than the 5.9% that folks experienced this year. We're joined by Rob Field, a fellow certified financial fiduciary at Nelson Financial Planning, also our resident national Social Security advisor. Good morning again, Rob.
Good morning, Joel. Good to be here.
There's certainly some interesting stats you shared in the last segment about the percentage of folks that rely on Social Security for, in essence, the majority of their income. Half of the folks out there rely on it for the majority of their income, 50% or more. So certainly this adjustment is going to be pretty important for a lot of Americans. So what's the predictions? What's the tea leaves, if you will, saying to you on this one, Rob?
The numbers are kind of they've been changing month by month, and so a lot of things are affecting that we'll get into in a second. But we are at that time of year where we start really evaluating what has inflation done to the cost of items that everybody uses, but particularly how would it affect Social Security. And so they're taking a look at these numbers, they compare them to similar numbers and the changes they might have made a year ago, and then they apply what they call the cost of living adjustment to Social Security.
Sure.
We did this show last year. We're excited. 5.9 was a pretty good, healthy number at
After
the time.
A number of years of basically nothing.
Right. We saw some years of
was
ones and less than ones, and we saw zeros, and really was 40 years ago was when we saw something in the sevens. Since then, it's been pretty low, and we know inflation is growing a lot higher than how that works. So we'll find out probably going into October what the exact number is going to be. But I looked at some different groups that are making their predictions. If you AARP, who's a big advocate of Social Security, they came out in August and they said, we're looking at probably 9%. That number is a little lower than what they had predicted earlier. Newsweek in July was saying 11.4.
Wow.
So then I was looking at CNBC. They're pretty good about looking at inflation and coming out with some numbers. In July, they said, we predict it'll be 10.5%. But then in August, they dropped it down to 9.6. A couple of things have changed. We've all experienced the increase in gas prices over the summer. It got pretty high, but it actually dropped down a little bit since what we saw the high of June. It's about 20% lower. That equates into their decision making of what the COLA would be, because transportation is a big factor, not only the consumer price index for the workers, but the CPI for the elderly, which we like to use more. And that those changes in gas prices, that carries over to transportation, utilities, the cost of things like that. So the number will be pretty high. It's going to be somewhere between, I would say, 8 and 11. It might not hit 11 if people kind of take into consideration gas prices have come down.
Particularly this notion of the impact that gas price has, right? Because that's a big, the gas price is such a big rippler through the economy. When you think about, when you go into the grocery store, all that stuff didn't just magically show up. It came by virtue of something that was using gas to get it there. So that has a massive ripple effect, if you will, throughout the economy.
No, you're right. The truck brings the food. If the gas prices are higher, it costs more to get it there. You got to pass those. Eventually, you and I are the ones who are paying for the higher prices.
Correct. That's the thing about inflation. It usually winds up in the consumer's lap. But it's interesting. There's a couple of different sort of measurements of inflation. So why don't you share with our listeners some of those different measurements of inflation that are out there?
Sure. We typically, when we talk about inflation and we talk about the consumer price index, it's the consumer price index for workers, which is kind of just the general index that looks at the cost of clothes and transportation, medical, housing, things like that. And it's kind of weighted depending on what they think that age group would use.
Sure.
When we look at Social Security, we're talking about a different age group.
That's correct.
And so there is an index called the CPI for the elderly, and it basically is looking at price changes for seniors that age 62 and above. And when you look at the comparison and the different weightings, the first thing you notice is that the cost of medical care for drugs and going to the doctor is about twice as high for the seniors as it would be for a normal person. The other thing would be housing. It's typically more expensive for the seniors to house themselves. Throw in assisted living, maybe it's bringing in caregivers. So when they make their decisions based on the CPIW, which is kind of just covers younger people, it's really not accurate in the change of pricing for the elderly.
Well, and I think that's probably the biggest reason why even the increases that we've had, which have been relatively low, absent this year's increase, really haven't allowed seniors to really sort of keep up, right? I mean, there's some interesting stats on just how much that difference in the inflation that the elderly folks experience versus the population as a whole. That's actually pretty dramatic.
Very true. I was looking at an article by the Senior Citizens League. It's a nonpartisan advocacy group that's focusing on the seniors. And they kind of came out and said, since the year 2000, inflation has decreased the purchasing power for seniors by over 40%, which is a much more dramatic number than everybody else. They're making their prediction based on this month of about a 9.6% cost of living adjustment. So even though those numbers might be lower than originally predicted, if we can get close to 10%, that's a nice, helpful jump to get the seniors kind of back online.
Well, especially if they're 40% behind over the course of the past 20 odd years. They've fallen 40% behind because they are experiencing much higher rate of inflation than certainly the population as a whole. So that's sort of the story on the sort of the COLA side of it. There's one piece that always pops up, and that, of course, is the Medicare side. Now, last year that had a pretty significant increase, which took a lot of the 5.9% increase away. It went from $148 up to $170 for Medicare Part B, so about a 14.5% increase. What's sort of the tea leaves on that look like? Because that's a big part of whether you actually get to keep your increase in your Social Security.
Right. We've talked about how medical coverage for the seniors seem to be rising faster than everybody else. What's interesting for the price increase that they did for Medicare Part B, which is the doctors, you got Part A is already covered in your Social Security. Part B is about a year ago, 2021, when they were looking at what they thought the cost would be in 2022, they were looking at a new Alzheimer's drug that had come out that was supposed to be extremely popular, but was also going to be very expensive. And so they built that pricing into it. We come a year later, it turned out to be that drug was really not that popular and not that expensive. So not only are the tea leaves saying, things will probably go up a little bit, there might be a credit, might bring it back down a little bit because they're technically overcharged, raised it higher than they should have.
Oh, that's interesting. So when they're coming up with that cost, they're kind of trying to predict what the medical needs going forward might be.
Right.
And if you're wrong, then you've overcharged people.
Right. And as a tendency, they'd rather be overcharged than undercharged.
I guess that's how the government works. Yes.
But the push now is like, hey, if you overcharged us last year, don't give us a huge increase in our cost. You're giving us more for the cost of living adjustment, but then you're also increasing our Social Security Part B. Let's consider the fact that maybe you went up too high last year. How about we don't do any increase? But that would be helpful. That's what I would like.
At the very least, there is a school of thought out there that would say that maybe your Medicare Part B premium doesn't go up, okay, as at all this year because it went up so much last year.
Correct.
Above and beyond perhaps what it should have. So that's certainly so. So I guess at the end of the day, it's all of this is sort of as is always, right? A little bit of a good news, bad news conversation. So we will recap that good news, bad news dichotomy when we return after these messages here on Dollars and Cents with Joel Garris and Rob Field of Nelson Financial Planning.